Somewhere in the ruins of Roman Britain, a war leader rides out to meet an enemy that outnumbers his forces 3-1. His men are exhausted. The towns behind him are burning, and yet, according to the sources that survive, he wins. Not once. Not twice, but 12 times in a row. Who was this man? Was he even real? And why has the world spent 15 centuries turning him into a king with a round table, a wizard advisor, and a sword pulled from a stone, when the actual story, buried beneath centuries of myth, is somehow even more extraordinary? Here is what historians rarely tell you. The legend of King Arthur did not begin as a fairy tale. It began as a desperate attempt to make sense of one of the most catastrophic collapses in European history, and the real figure, or figures, behind the myth lived through a darkness so profound that most of Western civilization simply chose to forget it ever happened. 3 questions will guide us today. First, did a real Arthur exist? And if so, who was he? Second, what actually happened to Britain after Rome abandoned it? And why was that collapse so total, so devastating, that it erased an entire civilization from memory? And third, why does this matter? Why has this particular legend refused to die for 1,000 years when so many others have faded? To answer those questions, we need to go back, not to Camelot, to a world that was already ending. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain had been part of the Roman Empire. That is not a small thing to absorb. 4 centuries is longer than the United States has existed as a nation. The Romans built roads that connected every major settlement. They constructed heated bathhouses, amphitheaters, and administrative centers. They established a monetary economy, a legal system, and a shared Latin culture that stretched from the Scottish lowlands to the coast of North Africa. Towns like Londinium, Eboracum, modern York, and Camulodunum, modern Colchester, were thriving urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands. And then, in the space of roughly 1 human lifetime, almost all of it vanished. This is the central historical mystery of Britain's so-called Dark Ages, and it is far more dramatic than any legend. The collapse was not gradual. Archaeological evidence shows that by the mid-5th century, coin use had essentially stopped. Pottery production, the kind of mass-produced wheel-thrown pottery that had been common for centuries, ceased almost entirely. Towns that had been continuously inhabited for 400 years were abandoned. The written record, which had been rich and detailed under Roman administration, goes nearly silent for more than 100 years. Historians call this period the sub-Roman era, roughly from 400 to 600 CE. It is one of the most poorly documented periods in all of British history, and it is precisely into this darkness that the legend of Arthur was born. Now, here is the first popular myth worth confronting directly. Many people assume the Dark Ages were simply a time of ignorance and stagnation, that nothing important happened, and that history essentially paused until the medieval period resumed. This is wrong in almost every important way. The sub-Roman period was not empty. It was violently, chaotically full. It was a time of mass migration, of kingdoms forming and dissolving within a generation, of plague, of famine, and of a cultural collision between the remnants of Roman Britain and waves of incoming peoples from across the North Sea. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, groups that would eventually give their name to England itself, were arriving in increasing numbers. Not always as invaders. Sometimes as mercenaries hired by the very British rulers who would later fight them. The situation was far more complicated and far more human than the simple story of Romans leaving and barbarians arriving. It is into this world, chaotic, contested, and desperate, that we need to place our search for Arthur. The earliest written sources that mention Arthur are not medieval romances. They are much older and much stranger. The first is a text called the Historia Brittonum, the history of the Britons, compiled around 830 CE, roughly 300 years after the events it describes. Its authorship is traditionally attributed to a Welsh monk named Nennius, though historians debate whether that attribution is accurate. This text lists 12 battles fought by a figure called Arthur, described not as a king, but as a dux bellorum, a Latin phrase meaning leader of battles or war leader. The distinction matters enormously. Arthur in this text is a military commander, not a monarch. He fights alongside British kings, but he is not one of them. The second key early source is the Annales Cambriae, the Annals of Wales, compiled around 900 CE. It records 2 entries connected to Arthur. The first, for a year that most scholars place around 516 CE, notes a battle at a place called Badon, where Arthur carries the cross of Christ on his shoulders, or possibly his shield, and the Britons are victorious. The second entry, for a year around 537 CE, records the Battle of Camlan, in which Arthur and a figure named Medraut, later transformed into the villain Mordred, both fall. That is essentially it. 2 texts, a handful of references. And yet from these fragments, an entire civilization of the imagination was constructed. So the question every historian eventually has to confront is this: do these sources reflect a genuine historical memory? Or are they later inventions designed to give the Welsh, the descendants of the Romano-British population, a heroic past to cling to during centuries of political defeat? The honest answer is that we do not know. And that uncertainty is not a failure of history. It is actually one of the most revealing things about the period. Here is what we can say with reasonable confidence. The Battle of Badon is real. Or at least it is real enough that it appears in a source far more reliable than Nennius or the Annales. A British cleric named Gildas, writing in the mid-6th century, close enough to the events to potentially have spoken with people who remembered them, describes a great British victory over the Saxons at a place he calls Mons Badonicus, Mount Badon. He does not name Arthur, he does not name any military commander at all. But he confirms that the battle happened, that it was a decisive British victory, and that it was followed by a period of relative peace. This is a crucial detail. Gildas is our best contemporary source for sub-Roman Britain, and he is not writing mythology. He is writing a furious moral sermon, condemning the British rulers of his own time for their corruption and sin. He has no reason to invent a great victory. He mentions it almost in passing, as historical context for his present-day complaints. So Badon happened. A major British military victory over Saxon forces, sometime in the late 5th or early 6th century. The question of who led the British forces, whether it was a figure named Arthur or someone else entirely, or whether Arthur was a title rather than a name, remains genuinely open. And this openness has driven historians to some fascinating and sometimes contradictory conclusions. One school of thought, associated with scholars like John Morris in his 1973 work The Age of Arthur, argues that Arthur was a real Romano-British war leader, possibly of aristocratic or even military family background, who unified the fragmented British kingdoms against the Saxon advance. Morris placed him in the late 5th century and constructed an elaborate historical portrait. The book was enormously influential with the general public. It was also heavily criticized by other historians for building too much on too little evidence. A competing view, held by many current academic historians, is more cautious. They argue that Arthur may be a legendary figure constructed around the memory of several real leaders, or possibly a figure whose historical existence simply cannot be confirmed or denied, given the available evidence. Some scholars, like David Dumville, have argued quite forcefully that the historical Arthur is a myth, not in the sense that the legend is unimportant, but in the sense that we cannot use it as reliable history. A third and genuinely intriguing possibility is that Arthur's name itself provides a clue. The name Arthur is unusual in early Welsh and British sources. Some linguists have suggested it derives from the Roman family name Artorius. And here is a wow fact that tends to stop people cold. There was a real Roman officer named Lucius Artorius Castus who served in Britain in the 2nd century CE. He commanded troops, he fought campaigns. He may have led forces from Britain to Gaul. Could a distorted memory of this man, or his family name, have attached itself to later legends? Most historians consider this connection speculative at best, but it illustrates how deep the roots of this mystery actually go. What is less disputed, and what is often overlooked in favor of the romantic legend, is the broader historical reality that the legend was trying to describe. Sub-Roman Britain was not simply invaded and conquered. It was torn apart from within as much as from without. The Roman withdrawal was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow, grinding process that unfolded over decades. In 383 CE, a general named Magnus Maximus stripped troops from Britain to support his bid for the imperial throne on the continent. He was defeated and executed. The troops never came back. In 407 CE, another general, Constantine III, did the same thing. Again, the troops never returned. By 410 CE, when the Emperor Honorius is said to have told the British cities to look to their own defense, though historians debate whether this famous letter was actually addressed to Britain at all, the Roman military infrastructure had already been hollowing out for a generation. What remained was a patchwork of local leaders, some with Roman titles and Roman cultural pretensions, others with older British tribal identities reasserting themselves. These men, the tyrants as Gildas calls them with barely concealed contempt, were fighting each other as much as they were fighting external threats. Some of them hired Saxon mercenaries to fight their British rivals. The mercenaries, discovering that Britain was wealthy and poorly defended, eventually turned on their employers. This is the world Arthur, real or legendary, was supposed to have navigated. Not a world of knights in shining armor and courtly love. A world of broken infrastructure, political fragmentation, plague, and desperate improvisation. The plague deserves a moment of attention because it is one of the most underappreciated factors in the collapse of sub-Roman Britain. Around 541 CE, a catastrophic pandemic now known as the Plague of Justinian swept across the Mediterranean world and into northwestern Europe. Some historians estimate it killed between 25 and 50% of the population in affected regions. Britain's already fragile social structures would have been devastated. Some researchers have argued that this pandemic, arriving after decades of political instability, was the final blow that transformed a struggling sub-Roman society into the genuinely fragmented, de-urbanized world of the early Anglo-Saxon period. This is one reason the Arthur legend is set specifically in the late 5th and early 6th century. That window, roughly 470 to 540 CE, is the last moment when a unified British resistance was plausible. After the plague, the demographic and political balance had shifted too far. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were consolidating. The British were being pushed west into Wales and Cornwall, and eventually Brittany across the Channel, where they carried their stories with them. And those stories grew. The transformation of the historical, or semi-historical, Arthur into the legendary king we recognize today happened in stages, each one adding new layers to the myth while burying the historical substrate deeper. The Welsh tradition kept Arthur alive for centuries in poems and tales that portrayed him as a superhuman warrior, a leader of a band of extraordinary companions, a figure who fought giants and monsters as well as men. These stories are wild and strange, nothing like the courtly romances that came later. In one early Welsh tale, the Culhwch and Olwen, Arthur's court is a gathering of bizarre specialists, men who can hear an ant moving 50 miles away, men who can drink the ocean dry. This is not medieval romance. This is something older and stranger, a warrior mythology that has been overlaid with Christian symbolism, but still carries the scent of something pre-Christian underneath. The decisive transformation came in 1138, when a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth published a work he called the Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain. Geoffrey claimed to be translating an ancient book in the British language. No such book has ever been found, and most historians believe Geoffrey invented or heavily elaborated the vast majority of his material. But his Arthur, a great king who conquers much of Europe, who is advised by the wizard Merlin, who is betrayed by his nephew and mortally wounded at Camlan, became the template for everything that followed. Geoffrey's work was an immediate sensation. It was copied hundreds of times. It was translated into French, into Welsh, into other languages. It gave the Norman rulers of England a mythological British past that could compete with the Carolingian legends of France. It was politically useful, culturally resonant, and brilliantly written. It was also, in significant part, fiction. From Geoffrey, the legend passed to French poets like Chrétien de Troyes, who added the Round Table, the quest for the Holy Grail, and the love story of Lancelot and Guinevere. Then to German poets, then back to English writers, culminating in Thomas Malory's La Morte d'Arthur in 1485, the version that most people who know the legend at all are actually familiar with, whether they realize it or not. Each retelling served the political and cultural needs of its moment. Geoffrey's Arthur justified Norman rule. The French romances reflected aristocratic ideals of chivalry. Malory's version, written while England was tearing itself apart in the Wars of the Roses, was a nostalgic vision of a unified kingdom under a just king. Arthur was always a mirror, reflecting the anxieties and aspirations of whoever was telling the story. But here is the thing that makes this history genuinely extraordinary, and not just as a literary curiosity. The core of the legend, a great leader who unifies a fractured people, wins a decisive victory, and then falls to internal betrayal, maps remarkably closely onto what we actually know about sub-Roman Britain. Not in its details, not in its magic, but in its emotional and political structure. The Britons of the 5th and 6th centuries really were a fractured people. They really did face an existential threat. They really did achieve at least one major military success at Bardon. And they really did ultimately fail, not because they were defeated in a single great battle, but because the internal divisions that Gildas describes, the competing tyrants, the hired mercenaries turned enemies, the failure to build lasting political unity, those divisions proved fatal over time. Camlan, the final battle where Arthur falls, fighting not Saxons but his own people, is in this reading not just a story. It is a mythologized memory of the truth, that sub-Roman Britain destroyed itself from within as much as it was destroyed from without. And then there is the most haunting element of the legend. The idea that Arthur did not die, that he sleeps in a cave, in Avalon, in Glastonbury, beneath a hill in Wales or Scotland or Brittany, waiting to return when Britain needs him most. The once and future king. This belief, known in Welsh as the concept of Mab Darogan, the son of prophecy, was not simply a fairy tale. It was a genuine political and spiritual belief held by Welsh and Cornish communities for centuries. When the Normans conquered England, some Welsh writers expressed hope that Arthur would return to drive them out. When the Tudors came to power, Henry VII named his eldest son Arthur, a deliberate piece of political mythology. The legend was deployed again to legitimize a new dynasty. The idea of Arthur's return has been invoked in times of national crisis, so many times that it has become almost a reflex of British cultural identity. Why? Because the legend encodes a real historical trauma. The people who built the legend had actually lost everything: their cities, their language, in much of what became England, their political independence, their Roman identity. They had been, within living memory, part of the greatest civilization the Western world had ever seen, and then that civilization was gone. The legend of Arthur was their way of saying, "We were great once. We can be great again. The loss is not permanent. The king is not dead. He is only sleeping." That is not mythology as escapism. That is mythology as survival. The archaeological work of the last several decades has added new dimensions to this picture without resolving its central mysteries. Sites like South Cadbury in Somerset have been excavated and found to contain evidence of significant refortification and occupation in the late 5th century, exactly the period when a historical Arthur would have been active. South Cadbury has long been associated with the legendary Camelot, though most archaeologists are careful to note that this association is traditional rather than evidential. What the site does show is that someone in that period was investing significant resources in building or rebuilding a major fortified centre. Whoever that was, they were a figure of real power and organisation. Tintagel in Cornwall, long associated with Arthur's birth in the Geoffrey tradition, has also yielded surprising archaeological finds. A 6th century Mediterranean wine jar, evidence of long-distance trade. And in 1998, a stone inscribed with a name, Artenu, meaning something like iron knower or bear knowing in the Brittonic language, was found there. The excavators were careful to state that this was not evidence of Arthur. But the name similarity to Arthur and the date and location of the find made it one of the most discussed archaeological discoveries in recent British history. What these sites collectively suggest is that sub-Roman Britain was not the complete void that older historical models assumed. There were people of wealth and power operating in this period. There was trade. There was fortification. There was political organization. The darkness of the Dark Ages is partly a darkness of our own making, a result of the loss of written records, rather than the loss of human activity. And somewhere in that activity, in that desperate, creative, violent, remarkable period of British history, the legend of Arthur took root. Whether from a real person, a composite of real people, a borrowed name, or a pure cultural invention, the legend grew because it answered a need that was itself completely real. The need to believe that even in the worst darkness, someone was fighting back. That the loss was not final, that the story was not over. 15 centuries later, that story is still being told. In novels, in films, in television series, in academic journals, in the ongoing excavations of sites that may or may not have been touched by a man who may or may not have existed. The legend of Arthur has outlasted every dynasty that tried to use it, every political system that tried to claim it, every scholarly generation that tried to debunk it. That is not an accident. That is what happens when a story captures something true about the human condition, the refusal to accept that what was built cannot be rebuilt, that what was lost cannot be recovered, that the king in the cave will never wake. The real history of Arthur and Britain's Dark Ages is not a story about a knight in shining armor. It is a story about what people do when their world collapses. How they fight, how they fail, how they remember, and how, in the act of remembering, they sometimes create something that lasts longer than the civilization that was lost, that, in the end, may be the most extraordinary thing about the whole story. Not that Arthur might have been real, but that the legend itself became real, real enough to shape kingdoms, inspire revolutions, and still capture the imagination of anyone willing to look past the magic sword and ask what was actually happening in the ruins of Roman Britain all those centuries ago. What do you think? Was there a real Arthur behind the legend, a single war leader whose victories were mythologized over time, or is the legend itself the more important historical artifact, regardless of whether any individual inspired it? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one of them, and the debate on this one is always fascinating. If you found this breakdown valuable, the real history beneath the myth, without the filler, subscribing means you will not miss the next one. This channel exists to do exactly this. Take the stories everyone thinks they know and show you what is actually underneath. And speaking of what is underneath, in the next video we are going to follow the Anglo-Saxons themselves, the people who, in the legend, are the villains, and discover that their own story is just as complicated, just as dramatic, and just as misunderstood as Arthur's. Because history, as always, looks very different depending on which side of the hill you are standing on.